if peak oil happens and people don't understand what's going on, it could very easily be a global tipping point. It is basically every bit as serious as thermonuclear war. We thought that was really serious. Now, you could argue that was silly. We spent 50 years worrying about that, and we never had one. I would argue maybe one of the reasons we never had one is that we worried about it for 50 years.
It's going to be a dramatic, catalytic event for the human family.
We're heading for the cliff at 80 miles an hour, and the brakes are out.
The four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, pestilence, and death.
It will be painful, and it will be very disruptive, and it will revolutionize the way that we live.
In a period of hundreds of millions of years, with enormous pressure and heat, the Earth formed petroleum from decayed living matter. And in less than 150 years, by many estimates, we have bled the planet of roughly half of its oil. We have extracted roughly 1 trillion barrels of oil since the late 19th century. Most of that oil has been consumed by Western societies, and it has been, arguably, the basis for the enormous power and wealth of Western nations. Now, most of the remaining oil on Earth lies underground in less industrially developed countries. In order to get that oil, and to get it as cheaply as possible, Western companies have devastated environments and caused terrible human suffering. People in Western societies are largely unaware of the harm caused from oil extraction. We are unaware because it goes unreported. Now we are confronted by the prospect of world peak oil. Peak oil is the point in time where the quantity of petroleum extracted from the Earth begins to irreversibly decline. As fossil fuels are so deeply intertwined in our existence, particularly our food production, the results could be catastrophic, especially in the face of rapidly rising oil demand. And as oil becomes scarce and prices rise, the environmental destruction and human suffering will likely increase. And the competition for oil will get more aggressive.
One of the most common questions that people ask is, do you think that the peak oil that you write about is going to produce a global catastrophe? And my answer is, it already has. There are people dying right now as we're speaking. There are people dying right now over oil. There are governments being twisted and and changed and seized over oil. The climate is changing because of oil. And there's a small group of very, very wealthy people who are getting richer and richer because of oil.
Energy derived from fossil fuels has been the source of the incredible growth of the human population. It may be the single greatest impact fossil fuels have had on the planet.
You can trace human evolutionary success in terms of the rates at which we've been able to appropriate energy from our environment. There's virtually no human population growth for, let us say, 50,000 years prior to agriculture. But with agriculture, we began to modify entire landscapes, replacing other species with food crops that we wanted for ourselves. And the human species spread over the planet in greater and greater numbers.
Then something happened a couple of hundred years ago, actually a little bit more. We started using coal to burn, to release energy.
And therefore, we were able to cut down the forests, which had been a fuel source before, and replace them with fields where we could grow food. We increased the food, we increased the number of people. By 1800, we hit our first 1 billion people. So all of human history, all several 100,000 years of modern human history, to produce that 1 billion people in 1800. Now we're starting to get really efficient at the use of ancient sunlight. In fact, we found a more transportable form of it, oil. In 1867, Colonel Drake drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The second billion people took only 130 years, 1930. The third billion took only 30 years, 1960. The fourth billion took only 14 years, 1974. The fifth billion, 1987. And the sixth billion, 1999. So we've seen this explosion of population. And it's been fueled by the availability of fossil fuels.
As population rose, so did consumption levels, driven mostly by Western industrialized nations. Our dependence on petroleum grew to roughly 1.3 trillion gallons per year, along with our dependence on an equal amount of energy from a combination of coal and natural gas. That amount of oil, stacked in 5-gallon containers, would reach to the moon over 250 times in a single year.
I calculated that in a single person's life in this country, you will be confronted at one time or another in your life to about 30,000 different items that have a very intimate connection with fossil fuels. We don't have time to enumerate the 30,000 items, okay? But they are there, from the light fixtures to the paint in your house to the pesticides, insecticides, the fibers, the fabrics, heart valves, composite material, aircrafts of the future, vehicles of the future. The list goes endlessly.
Fossil fuels provide energy for production and transportation of virtually every product we own or consume. And many of those products are actually made from petroleum. To get an idea of how deeply embedded fossil fuels are in our everyday products, let's take the example of a nylon shirt. Nylon itself is made from crude oil. An enormous amount of energy is used throughout the process of creating the shirt, almost all of it fossil fuel energy. First, the crude oil is extracted from the ground. Then it is shipped to a refinery where it is distilled into chemicals that make nylon. The polymers are shipped to a factory to create the nylon thread. The thread is then shipped overseas where, using machinery and labor, the shirt is made. Then it is shipped back to North America and trucked to a store. The consumer drives a car to the store, buys the shirt, and drives back home. The shirt is not only made of oil, it's awash in oil. A similar trail of energy use can be followed for nearly every product we consume. But nowhere are fossil fuels more critical to humanity than in the production of food.
Every organism has to get more energy from its food than it expends in getting its food. Like coyote, if it has to spend more energy in running down the rabbit than it can get from eating the rabbit, it's not a good situation. And if this happens habitually over time, the coyote dies. We human beings have been able to get around that constraint through the use of fossil fuels. We use natural gas as a feedstock for chemical fertilizers. We use oil to make chemical pesticides and herbicides. And then we transport foods ever further distances. We're using far more energy than we'll ever get from eating the food. For every calorie of food energy we get, we've invested something like 10 calories of energy in growing the food, transporting it, cooking it, and so on. For any other organism, this would spell extinction.
One of the foundational myths of our culture is based on a truth and a lie. The truth is that if you're naked and hungry and outdoors and it's cold and raining, you're unhappy. I think we can all agree on that. And if somebody brings you in and gives you clothing and sets you next to a fire and gives you a big bowl of soup, you go from being unhappy to happy real quickly. Your basic needs are met. So that's the truth. The lie is that, well, if that amount of stuff will make you that happy, then twice as much stuff will make you twice as happy. 10 times as much stuff will make you 10 times as happy. 100 times as much stuff will make you 100. 1,000 times as much. 1,000,000 times as much. And Bill Gates lives in a state of perpetual bliss. That's the lie. It's one of the things that is driving us to destroy this earth and ourselves.
Well, there's actually been polling over many decades in happiness levels of various populations. If you look at the polls today as opposed to the polls in the 1950s, Americans are just about as happy on average as they were 50 years ago. And yet consumption levels have tripled during that period.
Now, that being the case, how is it that we've compelled ourselves into this world in which material growth becomes the primary focus of almost all of our endeavors? And what we find is that, in many respects, the power of this myth, again, overrides all the data that suggests we've far exceeded the level of consumption required for a sense of personal well-being. There are volumes of letters written by people who were on the Titanic who survived, but they recall having argued with other passengers to get in the lifeboats, get in the lifeboats. And there are a couple of accounts of people holding up the brochure of the Star Line saying, "Why should I get in the lifeboat? It says right here that this is an unsinkable ship." And that again is the power of myth. These people would obviously rather believe in the power of the myth than in the necessity to change their way of being and get in the lifeboat. Well, look, we're all looking for lifeboats now, and we should be encouraging each other to get in those lifeboats. Abandon the myth. If we keep behaving this way, the ship will go down.
The American way of life, to put it bluntly, is not sustainable. This quote of George I in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit in 1992 was that the American way of life was not open for negotiation at that summit. And at the same time, he was very prominently sort of speeding around in his speedboat off of Maine, and that sort of epitomizing the American way of life. I think that does really represent a big challenge in terms of the U.S. relationship to the rest of the world. The very heavy, disproportionate use of resources in the U.S. is very well known and understood throughout the world, and it's one of the things that the U.S. is resented for.
When I hear our leaders tell us that the American way of life is non-negotiable, the first response that comes to my mind is, well, yeah, maybe, but beyond a certain point, nature doesn't negotiate. We may want to maintain the American way of life indefinitely into the future, but the fact of the matter is, it's just not in the cards. The world does not have the resource base to enable us to maintain this way of life. And ultimately, that's a good thing. I mean, if you could imagine the rest of the world attempting to live as we are indefinitely, the consequence would be the destruction of the biosphere.
We roughly consume twice as much of almost everything as the Europeans do. The Europeans, of course, have a standard of living that is very, very close to ours. So that's a very striking difference. Not only do we use the most in the world, we use 25% of the world's oil with 4.5% of the world's population, but we're actually expanding our use of oil on a year-on-year basis. So the current reality is that the U.S. is profligate, wasting oil, setting a bad example.
The Bush administration is in a trap. They're in a trap because they've made a commitment to preserve the existing energy paradigm in this country, the existing industrial paradigm of big oil, big automobiles, big highways, and all that goes with it. And the only way to preserve that paradigm is to gobble up more and more of the rest of the world's oil. There is no other way to do it. The only way to get out of this is to reduce our dependency on petroleum, period. We have to consume a lot less oil in our day-to-day lives. There is no other way to break out of this trap.
Consumption of almost everything is going up dramatically and has the potential to rise to many times the current level because of the fact that you've got large parts of the world population, China, India, Africa, etc., that are really just entering the stage where they have people that are having, amenities like transportation, heating, air conditioning, and all the rest of it.
The Chinese want to have every one of them, once they make this transition from the agrarian, poor, $1,000 a year existence, they want to buy a private car. Consider this. There is 1.7 people per car in the United States. There are 117 people per car in China.
If every Chinese were to consume the way Americans do, we would need 6 planet Earths to support the global economy. China is certainly becoming a big consumer of almost everything, and that's not too surprising given that China has 1.3 billion people, and it's had an economy that's been growing at 8 to 10% a year really consistently for the last, at least 15 years. We've seen that most obviously in the oil market, but Chinese demand has driven up everything from oil prices to steel prices, cement prices, wood prices, almost everything over the last couple of years.
A sizable chunk of China's industrial generated surplus will have to be spent to acquire energy, which then in turn will help them further improve their industrialization, and it will create further energy demand, and it becomes this vicious cycle. They are absolutely terrified about this cycle of increase in demand, further increase in industrialization, and increase in demand over and over again. It cascades from there on. China has gone berserk in its energy demand. There has never been a country in the history of the energy business that has increased its energy demand by 20% in 1 year, and China did it in 2005.
China's increasing its oil imports at a dramatic rate. China has now become the world's second foremost oil importing nation after the U.S.
The United States will not be the reality of the world economy over the next 13, 15 years from now. China is going to be the reality in the world energy situation and in the world economy, in fact. They already have a $600 billion surplus, trade surplus this year. They don't care about the oil price. They are going to go out there and get the energy